We are live. Good. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Arctic Basecamp. I am Gail Whiteman. I'm a professor of sustainability. I'm also the founder of Arctic Basecamp, which is a science communication not-for-profit. We are here in Glasgow at COP26, live in a real Arctic Basecamp tent, and we're absolutely delighted to be hosting Sophia Scott and Team UMIAQ, who have just come back from Greenland, and we've just seen the film. We've got a panel discussion for about 30 minutes, and I'm going to kick off. But first of all, I'm going to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves briefly. And we'll start with Sophia, and we'll work our way down, and then I got a couple of questions, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gail. Well, I am Sophia Scott. I'm the founder of Ground Truth Global and also Ground Truth Productions. So we put this expedition together with these wonderful people.
Great.
I'm Sarisha Mann. I work on sustainable finance engagement and communication at BNP Paribas and had never really been sailing until we did this expedition.
Angie did a fantastic job. I'm Mads. I'm a tropical marine biologist and wildlife photographer and filmmaker, and it was an absolute honour to join this team of incredible women to document climate change in the Arctic and the subarctic.
Well, thank you. So my first question, I want to start with you, Sophia. Give me a bit of a background on why this film, why Greenland, and how did you choose your crew?
Well, I think after COVID, my sisters and I, who run Ground Truth Global, we design high-performance backpacks, and we're not just about products at all. In fact, they are secondary. We're storytellers, we're filmmakers, and so for us, it was very important to try and put together an expedition where we can use our bags and test some of the materials that we've been innovating out of recycled plastics and captured carbon, but tell an important story at the same time, and when you look at climate change, it's all happening up there, and I think it's quite a hard place to get to. And I think we just decided that we should really try and go without much of a carbon footprint, so it made sense to sail there. And I had been talking to Felicity Aston, the polar explorer, about another expedition next year, and she said, oh, well, I know this great sailor, Joan Malloy, let's get her on board. And then it's we needed to raise investment, we needed a drone pilot, a second camera person, that's when Maz came involved. Rish, obviously, with the bank and your expertise of sustainable finance, which is really critical for the future, because that's where change can happen. And we very quickly put together this team of women. And I think we all brought something very different to the table, and we learned a lot from each other. It was challenging. It's quite nice to be outside of your comfort zone. I mean, I was really seasick. Which took me by surprise, but as Felicity said, I think you need to push yourself a little bit. I mean, the world is not a comfortable place, particularly at the moment, and if you're too comfortable, you sit back and you do nothing. And that's what we really tried to be uncomfortable, and it worked in some ways.
Yeah, it certainly looked very uncomfortable at moments, and seasickness is a pretty difficult thing. Now, Sharisha, I want to say, what is a banker doing on a boat going to Greenland? Why this? How did you say yes, and how did you get time off work from your day job?
So I think the one thing I'd say, second Sophia's point on learning from people, I think the one huge shift we've seen in finance over the last few years is the fact that we're embracing knowledge completely from other areas of not just our industry, but the world. And I think learning from Mads as a biologist and Sophia as someone that's really at the forefront of circular economy is things that we need to embrace within finance. My own background is as an economist, so I used to work as an economist for BNP Paribas, and I think a lot of the issues that we saw in Greenland in terms of the adaptation challenges are actually driven in terms of sustainable economic development. So many of the issues around transitioning from legacy industries and also quite carbon intensive industries will require engagement with the community, and we met a lot of people that worked in shipping that wanted to transition into tourism, for example, and their challenges are very ingrained at an economic grassroots sustainable development issue level, and yet that's not necessarily something that we see when we create innovation for finance to challenge those issues. So I think learning from scientists and communities is really vital as we look to progress what finance can do to support some of these key challenges.
Excellent. So Mads, you're both. You've got a great combination. You know, you do all this great drone footage. It was gorgeous. I heard you telling the person you were sitting beside which shots were yours. So that was good to know. But you're also a biologist. So walk us through a little bit about how the Greenland ecosystem. And I realize you're not a polar expert, but you've learned a little bit about the science, I'm sure, and you know a lot about biology in general. Why is Greenland so important, and especially the Greenland ocean connection?
Okay, gosh, this is a great question, and not one that I'm going to be very proficient in answering because I'm actually a tropical marine scientist. But fundamentally, every ecosystem in the world has its own individual function. It has its own unique set of species, and everything is so interlinked. You've got this trophic web of species that revolve from tiny, tiny little plankton at the bottom to the massive whales that sit on the top, and every ocean on the Earth is connected by water. And so the Greenland ecosystem, well, the Arctic ecosystem, is incredibly important, not just as like a standalone ecosystem, but it feeds into global food security, fish populations that many of us will eat every single day if you do eat fish. So when we look at Greenland and the way that the ecosystem is changing, and one of the things that I learned that I didn't know before is that the ecosystem can change in a single year if the glacier in 1 year is terminating in the fjord water to the next year when it's retreated back up onto the land and it no longer, or what they say, terminates into the water. And the reason why is because when you have these glaciers there, they're depositing the sediment from the glacier straight into the fjord. And when the ice actually breaks off and calves, if you could see in the drone footage, it stirs up all of the sediment on the bottom as well. And this is a lot of nutrients, which then obviously allows phytoplankton and zooplankton to take those nutrients. And the whole ecosystem basically changes depending on whether the ice is present there or not. And as you saw in this film, we're losing so much ice so quickly that in single years, these ecosystems can change. So it's not only an incredibly important ecosystem, but it's one that is so in the middle of transition right now that, I mean, I don't know what the knock-on impacts will be, and I don't even think all scientists know how extensive the impacts will be, not just locally, but across the world when we lose all of this ice altogether.
Right. I couldn't agree more that there's a massive change happening in the Arctic, and the data is certainly showing that the Arctic is in crisis. Warming 3 times faster than the global average on the latest IPCC report. And certainly both the sea ice in the Arctic and the Greenland ice cap have a massive role to play in terms of the global climate system. So research is suggesting that we lose the snow and ice, and that will amplify global warming by 25 to 40%. And that's not the ice sheet in Greenland, that's the snow and ice in the land and the sea ice. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. That's what, the reason why Arctic Basecamp, for example, is here in Glasgow, not just to have a nice event space for your lovely film, but also to try and remind leaders while we're here that they need to pay attention to what is happening in Greenland, in the sea ice, and also in the land in the Arctic, where we've got massive permafrost, potential thaw, which will be the biggest wild card. Coming back to you, Sophia, who's your target audience for this film?
Yeah, I'm always thinking about that when I make films, and I always say everybody. But actually, that's not a good answer, I don't think. We made this film specifically to share with the wider audience, but also for an American audience. So Outside Magazine, Outside TV, they have a very wide audience of people that do like outside extreme sports. I think it's really important to engage people that are not just kind of on the science train already. So I think it's a soft science. It's not full of lots of details. It's kind of quite digestible. It's understandable. I guess it's for people that kind of just need to have a little bit of an emotional awakening and also see these places that are hard to get to. So I think our audience probably are not the hardcore scientists who know all the facts already. It's kind of like little bits that make you aware of things, can then make you change in your everyday, whether you're a teacher, a student or a leader, and I think in business as well. I mean, I'm hoping that with this film, through, the bank, through Helly Hansen, the sailing company, they're looking to change how they make all of their outdoor products. Their supply chain might now not be perfect, but if they look at how they can improve things, then that's the knock-on effect that I think is important. But as an audience, I always say actually it is everybody. But with this, I would say not the total experts in the room. I don't know what, yeah.
And what about the reaction that you had as the crew on this sailboat? You know, Sharisha, I was really taken by two things that you said in the film. The first one, that you hadn't been on a ship and you hadn't been to Greenland before, and then when you look very emotional seeing the glacier. Can you just describe to us like how that felt and what impact has that had on you as, I guess, a business professional and a human being?
I think a lot of my own kind of drive in sustainability has stemmed from spending a lot of time in the outdoors, and I've done a lot of research in terms of engagement on sustainability in the outdoor industry, and so my value system of even getting into finance was driven by this real belief that we can do better in terms of trying to get an economy that is considerate of nature and values nature. And I think for me, seeing that glacier deplete is very much the case that you understand the value of nature, but when you see it diminishing in front of your eyes, that's much bigger than the economists saying that 50% of global GDP is at risk of biodiversity loss. I mean, I understand that economically, but then when you see it, it's kind of the real physical risk of climate change in action. And I think from the perspective of what Sophia just said, I think all of the work that's going on in finance to look at, for example, the task force for climate-related financial disclosures, all of these quite abstract concepts that we see as nature-related risk, we really felt that in terms of the personal story that we all went on the trip. And I think a lot of what I've learned at COP has been really trying to connect with some of those communities that are most affected. So we saw it at an environmental level, and at COP it's been really interesting to hear from some of the indigenous communities that are at the forefront of that fight. And you saw Victoria in the film. She's actually at COP. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but she has some brilliant ideas of the types of ways we need to bring knowledge to the table in an arena where finance is present, but that it's a respectful and open space where we can progress finance to learn from communities that actually understand those issues.
And how did you bring this back into the bank, into BNP Paribas? Is this something that you should the CEO, should the board, should they be going to Greenland and seeing these calves? What's the next steps?
Sure. So I think the big value from my perspective of this expedition was the shared knowledge. So I think some of the discussions that, for example, Mads and I had on biodiversity metrics is something that we'll definitely take back into the organization to try and understand, when we look at solutions on the blue economy, how do we actually address some of those key frameworks that need to look at nature-based solutions in an ocean environment? Because some of the discussions we had on materiality is where I think the direction of finance is going. It's on understanding the material issues within climate science and biodiversity, and applying those in a way where we can work with companies. We have hundreds of clients across different markets, and I think for us it's about understanding how do some of those real nature-based issues impact them, and then bridging that dialogue with experts who are in science or entrepreneurs like yourselves that understand the solutions to those issues.
Thank you. Now, Mats, you know a lot about oceans. You're a marine biologist, so you're used to spending your time in the ocean environment. What was different, though, about going to the Arctic Ocean than being in the tropics? What were your key takeaways?
So it's funny, I actually did a talk a couple of days ago, and the one thing I spoke about was actually how the parallels were everywhere between Greenland and the tropics, because you get there and the waters of the fjord are bright blue. They're like this tropical aqua. I mean, we came in and we were looking over the side and we were thinking, how is it this shade of blue? It's so vibrant. And you could see on the drone there, you look down and you're like, what? So that was so similar. And, the wildlife, the amount of crazy wildlife everywhere, that was so similar. And, the feeling of loss the whole time, that was so similar. I mean, I watch coral reefs bleach and die every year, and that for me is horrific. And coming here and literally seeing another very visual representation of climate change, again, I just said, it's the same environmental grief feeling that I've had before. And then, so I actually studied bioacoustics, so the sound that the natural world makes, and coral reefs make this incredible like snap, crackle, pop noise. It's made by all the living biota on the reef, so you have little shrimps that they have these, what are they called, claws, and when they do this air bubble pops and snaps, and the fish take chunks out of the coral, and it creates this soundscape where essentially the louder the reef is, it indicates there's more life, so it's healthier. And then when we got to the Arctic, as you saw with Felicity there, with all these ice bubbles, this trapped air coming out of the ice, it sounds exactly the same. It's like snapping and crackling and popping like Rice Krispies. This is not a plug, but it sounded like that. But yeah, the one thing that was different is it was cold. I'm not gonna lie. I got in the sea and I'm used to diving in a bikini, and then suddenly I'm in like thermals underneath a dry suit. Like couldn't even get into it on my own, and it was brilliant. But it was cold. I remember it got in, and the only bit of your face that's exposed are your lips, and I was thinking. I got out and I literally couldn't speak. I was like, oh, guys, can you get me out of my dry suit? So yeah, that was the difference.
And a follow-up question on that. What about the microplastics, though? The stat that was on the film, 99% of samples that have been done in the Arctic Ocean show strong evidence of microplastics. Explain that.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one. I think it's difficult because the whole ocean has microplastics, and now pretty much every landmass has them. I mean, they've even found them on Everest. A good friend of mine wrote a paper that came out this year that showed that there are now plastic microfibers on the top of Mount Everest, which is just insane. Every ecosystem in Earth, whether it's carried by wind or ocean current, they seem to be everywhere. Now, in terms of microplastics, as we've seen, they are there in the Arctic, but compared to what we've seen in samples out in Indonesia, which is a massive plastics accumulation zone, because plastics tend to congregate, especially microplastics, where the ocean gyres converge, where the ocean currents kind of enter. There's 5 of them on Earth, these cycles, and we call them garbage patches, because that's literally where they are. And I actually just spent the last couple of years working for a microplastics research company called Expedition, and we did lots of expeditions out to these gyres, and something that the girls said on board when they got there is they expected to see these ocean garbage patches that were filled with, floating plastics, but they got there, they didn't see anything, and they were like, wait, the map says we're in the middle of the gyre. And they did the microplastics trawls, and I mean, it was thick with microplastics. It was awful. So, the Arctic, like everywhere else, does have these microplastics, but one thing that struck me as someone who's worked out in Indonesia, and actually we were just having this conversation, is there we looked at the beach and it was, oh my god, it's so remote, it's so shocking, and there's plastic here. But for me, I was going, guys, I've never seen so little plastic in a remote environment. I was like, what's going on? This is shocking. And the shocking thing was that I was shocked to not see plastic, because in Indo and the remote beaches that I worked on, I mean, you wade in it up to your knees, like just to get onto the shore, because there is so much there. So it's there, it's in the Arctic, it's in all marine life, but I was actually shocked at how little we found, to be honest.
So that was a good news sign. I want to take some questions from the audience. Let's start with 2 questions. I don't know how far this cord will come up. So why don't you just come up and will that one go? Because this one is kind of it goes to the back. Okay.
Thank you. I do have a question, but I wanted to say, Sophia, on your point that, your film is just not for the hardcore scientists, but as a scientist, I just wanted to say that actually it is for us as well, because it definitely touched me. And, we're all scientists, but we might not be specialists in the Arctic. So I think, as also a tropical marine biologist, it was fantastic and very eye-opening. And my question is not necessarily about the film, but about your bags. And you mentioned that you're incorporating carbon capture into them, and I'd love to hear more about that and how you're doing it.
Yeah, so thank you. So that's a good point. I mean, it is for everybody, the film, and that's good to hear that. So our bags, so on this expedition, we had very small pouches that we were testing. So at the moment, all of our backpacks are just made from RPT, so plastic bottles, in fact, all collected in Indonesia. Indonesia has a huge plastic crisis. So we decided to manufacture them there and collect the plastic from there. But that was just the first step when we launched a couple of years ago. Our idea is that we want to clean up after ourselves and make really high-performance, durable bags. Less is more. So one hybrid backpack to fit all environments. So the captured CO2 is in collaboration with a company in Canada that are capturing the CO2, and they're combining it with binding substances. So they're using calc or offshots of coal, and then we're mixing it with the plastic. So last year during COVID, we were mixing it with the recycled plastic bottles, and actually it was making it very brittle, and so they would snap, and that's because our PET is brittle. It's already been recycled so many times. So they've now started combining it with recycled car tires and polyethylene, so household waste, and that's actually given us a very, very strong, this is just a prototype, but these will be designed. So that is made from captured CO2 and the car tire, the recycled car tire, which obviously there is a lot of, just to show that you can create really high-performing substances. You know, you can mix captured CO2 into concrete, and concrete then becomes more lasting, and you're cleaning up, you know, emissions. So the captured carbon thing is a tricky one. I'm interested in it because I think, you know, everything that we're sitting on in here right now could be made from our waste, whether it's emissions or plastic, and I think that's interesting and it's innovative. And it can apply to lots of different industries. So we're a small startup making backpacks, but you can apply that technology to lots of other industries, and that's interesting.
And I think quite a shocking fact is that the world is actually becoming less circular. So there was a report, I think it was the last time you were at Davos actually, that the world was around 9% circular. And now when they produced it, the latest one, it was around 8%. So that's the proportion of secondary materials used in the production process, and it's actually reduced. So I think it's great that Ground Truth and the team are looking at solutions for that, because this particular technology is applicable to lots of sectors, and it sort of alludes to the point that Gail made earlier around why would a bank go on an expedition like this, because I think to scale up these types of technologies, you have to have investment and collaboration with finance and with companies that could apply these technologies. So I think as much as it's now in a bag, I think there's no reason why, and that's where your approach is fantastic on the experimentation, because you invest so much in the experimentation of the material that then could apply to other sectors as well.
Great. Anybody else have another question? We have time for a couple more. I mean, I endlessly have questions, so there's not a problem on that. I'm just trying to share the love. Yeah.
Just a bit more of a general one. What would you say was your biggest challenge on the entire journey? Because you were obviously sailing for quite a while, and I have a friend that did the Clipper race, and she came back with some pretty horrific stories. So what would you say, like personally, from each one of you, what would you say was your biggest challenge that you came across on the journey?
That's a great question. Let's start with Mads. Let's start with you.
So I work on boats quite a lot, and I've never been seasick, and I've been very lucky about that. But I've worked on boats enough to know that no one is ever immune to seasickness. And so for this journey, I asked Joan, who's a professional sailor who spends her life at sea, and I was like, right, what should I take? Because she said, guys, take the drugs. And I was like, yep, 100%, I'll take all the drugs. She said, I buy these little scopoderm patches. So stuck them on, not all of them, I just had one on, and had it on for a few days. And then these guys were really feeling under the weather, and I was still bouncing around like, yeah, great, what, seasickness, this is all amazing. And then I suddenly realized I couldn't see, which as a filmmaker behind the camera, when you realize that you can't actually see what you're filming, I was like, this is more than a bit challenging. And then Felicity was like, yeah, I can't see either. And then Sophia was like,
She had 3 on.
oh, so Felicity didn't know what I did. She had 3 stuck on like all over her neck, and yeah, Felicity couldn't see either, and then Sophia, you couldn't see it, and then
I didn't take one of the patches until
the middle, and yeah, and then it got to that point where the seas were, as you can see, they were absolutely rolling, and I was like, right, I now need to make the decision of whether I want to probably be sick or if I want to be blind for the rest of the trip. So I ended up taking my patch off, and it was fine. But that was definitely my biggest challenge on the trip. What about you, Rish?
Definitely the sickness. So when we left the shore, I had a pack of Haribos, and I thought, oh, I'd be fine. And then I got so sick, and I couldn't even have water, and I thought, I was being very, very, very sick. And it was actually to the point where I was starting to sick up blood, and I thought, oh, this is really grim. And then in fact, Tessa had recommended, she's a sailor, and she'd recommended taking ginger biscuits, but I never want to see them ever again, because they were under my pillow, and every day, I think one ginger biscuit lasted us about 3 days, just because we were so sick.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? So we didn't actually see Rish for about 4 days. It did get to that point where we had to go in and just check that you were like still conscious and alive. It was, yeah. I really felt for you. You're the bravest person I've ever met to come on a sailing boat and to be that unwell. And then came out at the end. Every time I walked past, because Risha's bunk was opposite my room, and I come past like, la 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 la, can't see where I'm going. And Rish would be like, Mads, you good? Are you okay? And I was like, you're lying there, sicking up blood, and you're asking me if I'm okay. And yeah, you're a hero, Rish. You really are.
I think probably from my part, the hardest thing was actually getting access to be able to go into Greenlandic waters. Because of COVID, like when we arrived in Iceland before we set sail, there had been 12 cases, which was a spike in Greenland. And so they were like, no one can come. So we had a bit of mutiny on board with different opinions. And we finally all came together, realizing that we had to set sail, but that we didn't want to be stuck out into international waters, which is really dangerous. If something had happened and we did have bad weather, you need to have that safety to be able to go into a fjord or take shelter, you know. So I think that was my biggest challenge, because I was determined that we set sail, and we did eventually, but without kind of a lot of toing and throwing, and we all pulled together, and that was the nice thing with Emma and Joan as well, and Felicity. We all like got our contacts together, we all put our brains together, and we were on the phone. And we eventually actually bypassed that and got the access that we needed. But it still meant that we had to not go on land for 14, 15 days, it turned out. So we didn't make it up to Kangerlussuaq, which is where our aiming point was, but we stayed around the southern coast, which was actually really epic, and you could see a lot there. So that was my biggest challenge.
Okay, question from this gentleman, and then you, and let's take both of them at the same time. We'll answer, and then I have one final question, and we'll close the live stream.
Okay, thank you. I can certainly identify with that terrible personal experience with seasickness. It is the most awful thing. But generally, you know, the opportunity to engage with the whole experience was great. You know, the personal experience really, I think, brings it home to people like me who haven't done it. The question really was about the film and where it's like to be shown, what sort of outlets you hope it's going to be shown in.
Yeah, that's great. So if we could just take both questions at the same time, and then we can answer them as a group.
So obviously your three of you are kind of separate sectors in everything that you do. When you came back and you reflected on the trip, what were your emotions? Were they inspired or negative or positive? But it'd just be interesting to see from each of your different sectors.
Great, thanks. Let's start with Sophia. Let's find out where the film's going to be shown.
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, it's going to have another premiere at Kendall Mountain Film Festival later this month. And then the North American rights, because I was fundraising this in a very piecemeal way and we did it on a really extremely tight budget, I promised North American rights to Outside Magazine, which is a fantastic outlet in the US. So it will be on their channels from the end of this month. But in Europe and Asia and elsewhere, we have freedom to place it. And obviously, a film needs to be seen. So it's something that I'm working on at the moment. So if anyone has ideas of how it can actually be seen, please do talk to me.
And that includes the people watching on the live stream. So now let's talk about emotions. Then I have my last question. I know there's more hands. You can talk to them afterwards, but we're going to have to close the session. I have another session I've got to go to at COP26. So, and I do know that we're over time. So, emotional roller coaster ride, sure, but where are we ending up now?
So I came back feeling like we've got an even bigger adventure ahead, in the sense that we're one expedition team, but we really came back and had this sense of we need to work together, we need to collaborate, we need to cross-pollinate our networks as well. I think that's what's been so fascinating about COP, is the fact that even yesterday and today, I think we've connected with so many different people that can support each other's missions. And I think that's what, for me, is really critical, is that we don't operate in our silos when we get back. We work together, we learn from each other. Even today, I was talking to someone about Joan's mussel farm, because she's got some amazing work they're trying to do on carbon sequestration and mussel farming. And there's other companies that could learn from that. So I think it's really about ensuring that we leave the legacy as being an active engagement with each other and also with our different networks.
Fantastic. Mads, how about you? Where are you on the roller coaster ride of emotions?
Actually, funnily enough, being with these guys, hopeful. Definitely, there was a lot of bonding on the trip, and it just, opened up that feeling of when we work together, solutions. And I mean, Rish really hit home on how important sustainable finance is and how much of an impact the finance sector can have, because, I mean, I've been very much like poo-poo finance for a long time as a marine biologist, but actually Rish really did prove to me what we can get done when we work together, and it's been reinforced actually here at COP26. I mean, I haven't been hopeful for much of it, but the periphery events like these have really solidified that people do want to create change, and no matter what's going on in the very tight zone at the top, like, we can do this. So, yeah, hope.
That's good. I think it's also, that positive power of collaboration, but it's also the thing of like disconnecting to reconnect. And I think often there is so much noise. And when I came back to London, I was slightly startled by the noise, the smells, and actually I had plenty of time to think, even though we were very busy. And I think that's really important. We've got information at the tip of our fingers all the time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you can absorb it properly. So I think it's so important to take time and really take on board like possibilities and like focus on what we're going to do, because we live once, right? And the solutions are there, but we need to be brave enough to take them on board and carry it with them, And I think there's a lot of hard choices to be made, and I think we need to often move outside of the box.
To do that. Last question for me. Every day at the COP, any COP that you go to, they have a theme day, of course. Yesterday was adaptation, but today is Gender Day. This is about gender equality and the climate crisis. And, I couldn't not note that you have quite the girl squad on this film, on the crew. I'm just joining in on the end here for today. But, is there something about women and this trip that helped fuel it, or is that not the case? It's just a sort of a random coincidence that it was all you amazing women, Team UMIAQ.
No, it was deliberate, I must admit. And I think, working in the film world, I've worked with a lot of men, great men. I've got no issue with guys at all. But it is...
Hashtag guys are okay. Or some guys are okay.
But on this particular mission, I think, women work differently under pressure as well. And I think often, maybe the egos aren't there that put someone up on a pedestal, and that it's much more kind of equal. And I found that very much working with everybody, and I think it's quite refreshing. And, Felicity is going off in March to the North Pole, again with a group of 6 women. I'm probably going to be going with her. And they're doing a lot of research for NASA to see how women collaborate under pressure for outer space missions. So these longer expeditions to see how decisions are really made. And I think it is something interesting to look at. Men have been ruling the world for a longer period of time than we have had access to voting, for example. And so I think it's an interesting time. Not that men are not welcome at the table, not at all, but I think I often get asked as a filmmaker, what's it like to be a female filmmaker? Well, I don't know what it is to be a male filmmaker. And I'm proudly a woman, but it comes with, some issues. Right. Some of the ladies on the team, they had children at home, Joan was pregnant, and it's those kind of things. It doesn't stop them, and I think that's so important. If you want children, if you don't want children, if you have them, you can still do everything. It's not a hindrance.
Yeah, that was really impressive when Joan went in the ocean as well, and she was 4 months pregnant, leaving behind a young child. That was quite gripping. Yeah, Sharisha, Mads, how did the gender balance work on the ship, and was that a positive?
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. I think even from having worked in traditional finance and background as an economist, it's a very male-dominated environment, especially as an undergraduate economist. And then shifting through, it's interesting to see. We did some research on this at BNP Paribas in terms of the gender balance in sustainable finance, and actually sustainable finance has quite a amazingly large roster of women that work in sustainable finance, possibly more because of the way that the industry developed in terms of moving from CSR to sustainable finance becoming a strategic issue. And I think in a lot of the organizations that I've worked with and our teams, the women in those leadership roles have a very diverse perspective that they try and embrace. And I think equally there's some great men that work in sustainable finance, but I think it's that equality of both, and it's the equality of opportunity to give people a seat at the table. And I'm not a sailor, I'm not an explorer, I love hiking, but it was a real privilege to be part of this expedition, because having not been necessarily qualified or equipped to go on that, I think we all really chipped in and added a lot of value to the team, and I think I'm sure it would be equally valuable for a team of men, but I think being together as women was really special in that process.
Beautiful. Mats?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. So I actually do a lot of work with women in science. I have an organization called Women in Ocean Science, and our literal main aim is to amplify the voices of women in marine science around the world because, research has shown that women are more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors than men, and also women are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis than men. So, climate change really is a gendered issue, and it is really important that everyone has a seat at the table. And I'm spent my life trying to make sure, like, our main aims at Women in Ocean Science is to make sure that women's research is amplified. And, the biggest problem we have in marine science at the moment is that there's a massive disparity between men in positions of power and women who aren't, and which creates these huge power differentials, which means that the whole relationship in marine science is really affected by a lack of role models, a lack of confidence in those above you for women, and often safety. So I was really thrilled to join a team of women and to work so closely with them, and there is something very nurturing and very family-like almost that comes with working with a team of women, and I think it adds a new perspective. And yesterday we saw an absolutely fantastic film which Arctic Basecamp was involved with The Last Glaciers. I believe it's coming out next year, and honestly I cried so much. It was one of the best films I've ever seen about climate change, but for me I got to the end and I thought, wow, there were no female voices in that film. There were almost none, and it was a brilliant, but it was not a female voice film. And I thought the one thing that would have just given it a little bit more of an edge is to have felt that we were heard a little bit more in that film.
Well, thank you. I think we'll certainly send Craig a WhatsApp on that one. I definitely will. Yeah, I will. Yeah. Craig, next film. Talk to Mads. On behalf of Arctic Basecamp, I thank you so much, Sophia, Team UMIAQ, for coming here, showing the film. It's a delight for me to moderate this panel and see it. And for audience members, thanks for coming to Arctic Basecamp. Please go out and see our iceberg that is fast melting away. The iceberg we think is also female, so that just fits with the whole theme. And let's hope that this COP is more successful than we had thought coming in. So, thank you.